The laboratory explosion was neither an accident nor a random failure. It was the culmination of years of obsessive research, a calculated risk that would either prove Elena Rodriguez's genius or seal her professional doom forever. Elena's journey began in the forgotten archives of the Interstellar Communication Research Institute, a sprawling complex that had become a monument to humanity's linguistic inadequacies. Her predecessors had spent decades developing translation algorithms that consistently failed, producing nothing more than garbled nonsense when confronted with alien communication systems. The Institute was a graveyard of broken dreams. Entire research wings were dedicated to failed xenolinguistic projects, massive supercomputers that could process quadrillions of calculations per second, yet couldn't translate a single coherent message from the simplest extraterrestrial communication. Attempts. Researchers had gone mad, careers had been destroyed, and humanity remained frustratingly isolated from the galactic community. But Elena was different. Her background was as unconventional as her approach. Born to a Brazilian quantum physicist and a Japanese neural network engineer, she'd grown up at the intersection of impossible disciplines. While other children played with toys, Elena dismantled communication devices, rebuilt quantum computers, and developed an almost intuitive understanding of how information could be parsed, translated, and reconstructed. Her doctoral thesis had been roundly rejected by every major research institution. Conceptual translation through quantum entanglement and neurological mapping was deemed too radical, too impractical. The academic world saw her work as the ravings of a scientific mystic, a dangerous blend of theoretical physics, advanced linguistics, and what some called computational shamanism. The laboratory itself was a testament to her unconventional methods. Unlike the sterile, organized research spaces of her colleagues, Elena's workspace looked like the aftermath of a controlled explosion. Holographic displays flickered with impossible algorithms. Quantum computing modules were jury-rigged together, with a combination of cutting-edge technology and what could only be described as scientific improvisation. Her current project was both her greatest hope and her most dangerous experiment. Traditional translation attempts had always failed because they approached language as a static system. They tried to create direct word-to-word or concept-to-concept mappings. But language, especially alien language, was far more complex. It wasn't just about words. It was about intent, emotional context, cultural nuance, and the very fundamental way different species conceptualized reality. The explosion was intentional, a carefully orchestrated series of quantum cascades designed to push her prototype universal Translator beyond its previous limitations. Most of her colleagues had abandoned the project years ago. Dr. Marcus Chen, the Institute's lead researcher, had publicly ridiculed her approach. "Rodriguez is chasing ghosts," he'd said during a recent conference. "Humanity will never bridge the communication gap with alien civilizations. We're simply too different." But Elena knew something they didn't. Language wasn't just about communication, it was about understanding. And understanding required something more profound than algorithmic translation. Her prototype device was unlike anything ever created. It wasn't just a translator, it was a cognitive bridge, a device that could map the fundamental ways different species conceptualized reality. By using a combination of quantum entanglement, advanced machine learning, and a revolutionary approach to semantic parsing, she was creating something that could do more than translate words. It could translate consciousness itself. The smoke clearing from the latest experiment revealed a compact device no larger than a smartphone. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a sophisticated piece of electronic equipment. But Elena knew different. This was a weapon more powerful than any physical armament, a tool that could potentially reshape how intelligent species understood each other. Initial tests had been promising. The device had successfully translated communications between two completely disparate Earth languages with 99.7% accuracy, a feat that had never been accomplished before. But Earth languages were child's play compared to what she was truly attempting. Her goal was nothing short of revolutionary, creating a universal translation system that could bridge communication between fundamentally different species, potentially transforming humanity's place in the galactic community. As the last wisps of smoke dissipated, Elena allowed herself a rare smile. The next test would change everything. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. The orbital station's emergency klaxons screamed a warning that humanity might be moments away from total extinction. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of a command bridge packed with the most terrified diplomatic personnel she had ever seen. The Krexan Space Fleet, a massive armada of crystalline warships that defied conventional physics, hung in space like a constellation of razor-sharp death. 6 months had passed since her laboratory breakthrough. The Universal Translator prototype was now a compact neural implant, a technological marvel that looked like nothing more than a delicate silver filament smaller than a human hair. Embedded just behind her right ear, it hummed with a potential that most of her colleagues still couldn't comprehend. 30 seconds to potential weapons discharge, announced Commander David Reyes, his voice cracking with a mix of terror and desperate hope. The station's defensive systems were already preparing for what seemed like an inevitable annihilation. Humanity's first contact scenario was about to become its last. The Krexan were not like any species humanity had ever encountered. Silicon-based life forms that communicated through complex quantum resonance patterns. They were known throughout the galaxy for their zero-tolerance approach to miscommunication. Previous encounters with other species had often ended in immediate destruction. Entire civilizations vaporized for what the Krexan considered unforgivable linguistic transgressions. Elena understood what the others didn't. Communication was never just about words. It was about intent, context, the fundamental way consciousness mapped and interpreted reality. Her neural implant began to pulse with an intensity that made the station's electronics flicker. The quantum entanglement matrix she had developed wasn't just translating. It was performing a real-time cognitive mapping that went beyond anything previously conceived. "Prepare for final communication attempt," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. The diplomatic team looked at her like she was insane. Maybe she was. The first transmission burst from the implant was unlike anything in human communication history. It wasn't a message in any traditional sense. It was a complete cognitive package, a transmission that simultaneously conveyed linguistic meaning, emotional context, cultural framework, and species-level intent. What humans had interpreted as an aggressive posture was actually something far more complex. The Krexan weapon systems weren't preparing for war. They were executing an elaborate first-contact ritual that had been misunderstood by every previous species. The massive crystalline ships began to shift. Their geometric configurations transformed, creating patterns that were simultaneously a threat display, a cultural greeting, and a complex mating invitation. To human sensors, it looked like preparation for total destruction. To the Krexnaller, it was the most sophisticated form of interspecies communication. Elena's translator didn't just convert words. It translated entire consciousness states. "They're not here to destroy us," she said quietly. "They're here to evaluate us." The diplomatic team stared in disbelief as the weapon systems powered down. What should have been humanity's final moment became something entirely unexpected. Commander Reyes was the first to break the silence. "What just happened?" Elena allowed herself a slight smile. "We just had a conversation." The Universal Translator had done more than bridge a communication gap. It had rewritten the fundamental rules of interspecies interaction. In less than 3 minutes, humanity had gone from potential target to something far more interesting to the galactic community. But the translation was only the beginning. The Krexnallar's initial communication revealed layers of complexity that would take years to fully understand. Their language was a living matrix of quantum states, emotional resonances, and cultural memories that shifted with each transmission. What humans perceived as a single message was actually a multidimensional communication that could mean a dozen different things depending on the precise quantum configuration. Elena's implant continued to process, to learn, to adapt. Each microsecond brought new understanding, new layers of complexity. The device wasn't just translating. It was establishing the first true bridge between fundamentally different forms of intelligence. "We need to prepare a full report, Commander," Reyes said, still looking shell-shocked. Elena knew the report would be impossible to fully capture. How do you describe a communication that exists in quantum states? How do you explain a conversation that happens simultaneously on multiple levels of consciousness? The Crexen? Ships remained, now in what could only be described as a posture of intense curiosity. Humanity had just become the most interesting species in the galaxy, and they had no idea what was coming next. The aftermath of the Krexnalar encounter sent shockwaves through every research facility, diplomatic channel, and scientific institution across human-controlled space. What had begun as a potentially fatal first contact had transformed into the most significant breakthrough in interspecies communication in galactic history. Dr. Elena Rodriguez found herself at the center of a scientific and diplomatic hurricane. Her neural translation implant, now officially designated as the Quantum Conceptual Translation Matrix, QCTM, was being dissected, analyzed, and studied by the brightest minds humanity could assemble. The research facility was a fortress of innovation, located on a secure orbital platform far from Earth. Banks of quantum computers surrounded Elena's primary research station, each machine dedicated to unraveling the complex translation algorithms that had made the impossible possible. Holographic displays flickered with impossible data streams, linguistic patterns that seemed to dance between mathematical precision and pure artistic expression. What made the QCTM revolutionary wasn't just its ability to translate words. It was its capacity to translate consciousness itself. Traditional translation methods had always failed because they approached language as a rigid, linear system. Words, grammar, syntax, these were merely surface-level constructs. True communication was infinitely more complex. It was about intent, emotional context, cultural framework, and the fundamental way different species conceptualized reality. The Krexnalar communication was a perfect example. What humans had initially perceived as an aggressive posturing was actually an elaborate first contact ritual. Their language wasn't just spoken or written. It was a living, quantum state communication that existed simultaneously on multiple levels of consciousness. Elena's breakthrough came from an unlikely combination of disciplines. She had combined quantum physics, neural network engineering, xenolinguistics, and what some called computational anthropology. The QCTM didn't just translate, it performed a real-time, multi-dimensional mapping of cognitive intent. "It's like learning to speak not just the words," she explained to a panel of skeptical researchers, "but the entire cultural and emotional context behind those words." The implications were staggering. Previous translation attempts had always failed because they treated language as a simple input-output problem. But language was alive. It was a complex ecosystem of meaning, emotion, and cultural memory. The first comprehensive analysis of the Krexnalar communication revealed layers of complexity that defied previous understanding. What had seemed like a potential threat was actually a sophisticated diplomatic approach. The weapon systems that had terrified human observers were part of an intricate cultural greeting, simultaneously a display of technological capability, a test of potential diplomatic partners, and a complex mating ritual. Dr. Marcus Chen, who had previously ridiculed Elena's research, now sat in stunned silence during the initial briefings. The QCTM had done more than translate. It had provided a window into an entirely new way of understanding interspecies communication. "We've been looking at language all wrong," Elena explained during a classified briefing. "Language isn't just about words, it's about consciousness. It's about how different species perceive and interact with reality." The galactic community watched in stunned silence. Humanity had gone from a species barely noticed on the interstellar stage to the most significant communication breakthrough in known history. But with breakthrough came danger. Not everyone was happy about this revolutionary technology. The Quantum Diplomatic Corps recognized immediately that the QCTM was more than a translation device. It was a potential weapon more powerful than any physical armament. The ability to truly understand another species, to map their fundamental, cognitive processes, was a form of power that could reshape entire civilizations. Assassination attempts became a very real concern. 3 different alien intelligence agencies began developing countermeasures. Diplomatic channels became a minefield of complex negotiations and barely veiled threats. Elena understood the stakes. This wasn't just about translation. This was about understanding. About breaking down the fundamental barriers that had kept species isolated from one another for millennia. The QCTM continued to evolve. With each transmission, with each new species it encountered, the device learned. It adapted. It grew more sophisticated with each passing moment. Humanity had just changed the rules of interstellar communication forever, and they were just getting started. The galactic diplomatic nexus erupted in chaos. What had been a carefully maintained balance of power for millennia now teetered on the brink of complete transformation. Elena Rodriguez's quantum conceptual translation matrix, QCTM, wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was a diplomatic nuclear weapon that could obliterate centuries of carefully constructed interspecies relationships. The first emergency session of the Galactic Communication Oversight Committee looked more like a powder keg than a diplomatic meeting. Representatives from over 200 different species filled the massive holographic chamber, their various physiological forms maintained by complex environmental suits and translation fields. The Vornak delegate, a crystalline being that shifted colors with its emotional state, pulsed an angry shade of deep crimson. This technology represents an unprecedented threat to galactic stability, it transmitted, its words rippling through translation matrices. The ability to truly understand another species strips away the carefully constructed diplomatic buffers that have maintained peace for generations. Elena sat at the center of the storm, her neural implant humming with a quiet intensity that seemed to make the entire chamber nervous. She was the most dangerous person in the galaxy, and everyone knew it. Intelligence agencies from multiple star systems had already begun their operations. The first assassination attempt came just 3 days after the initial Krex-Nalar encounter, a genetically engineered neural parasite designed to target the specific quantum frequencies of her translation implant. It was intercepted by her personal security team, a group of ex-military specialists who understood exactly how valuable their charge was. The Quantum Diplomatic Corps offered her impossible bribes. Entire planetary systems as personal research, grants, access to technology so advanced it bordered on magic, complete immunity from any legal prosecution, unlimited research funding that would make the gross domestic product of most species look like pocket change. Elena's response was both simple and revolutionary. She uploaded the base translation algorithm to an open-source platform, making it impossible to suppress or control. Communication is a fundamental right, she stated during a globally broadcast press conference, not a weapon to be hoarded by the powerful. The move was calculated chaos. By making the basic translation technology freely available, she had effectively neutralized attempts to weaponize or monopolize the breakthrough. But the base algorithm was just the beginning. The full QCTM remained a complex system that required profound understanding to truly implement. Some species saw opportunity. The Zorntal Collective, a mercantile civilization known for their complex trade networks, immediately recognized the potential for unprecedented economic integration. Barriers that had existed for millennia could now be dissolved with true understanding. Others saw apocalypse. The Shadowed Confederacy, a species that had maintained power through intentional miscommunication and strategic opacity, launched a full-scale cyber attack to destroy the translation network. It was their biggest mistake. Elena's systems were quantum entangled, protected by algorithms that could predict and neutralize threats before they fully formed. The Shadowed Confederacy's attack became a spectacular own goal, broadcasting their most closely guarded secrets across every communication channel in the galaxy. Political boundaries dissolved. Cultural misunderstandings that had led to centuries of conflict suddenly became transparent. Species discovered that many of their long-held grievances were based on fundamental misunderstandings, communication errors that the QCTM could now resolve in milliseconds. The Galactic Communication Oversight Committee descended into pandemonium. Some representatives demanded immediate restrictions. Others pushed for complete open access. A few simply tried to understand the fundamental shift that was occurring. "This isn't just translation," Elena explained, her voice calm amid the diplomatic hurricane. "This is understanding, pure, unfiltered understanding." Her neural implant continued to evolve with each transmission. It was learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated with each interaction. The QCTM was no longer just a device. It was becoming a living system of communication, a bridge between consciousness itself. Humanity had just changed the rules of interstellar interaction forever, and they were just getting started. The transformation was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Quantum Conceptual Translation Matrix, QCTM, was more than a technological breakthrough. It was a cultural defibrillator that shocked dormant communication pathways back to life across hundreds of civilizations. Research facilities on Earth could barely keep up with the flood of requests, inquiries, and collaborative proposals. What had begun as Elena Rodriguez's personal obsession had become humanity's most significant contribution to galactic civilization. Universities across alien worlds began establishing dedicated xenolinguistic research centers, with human communication experts suddenly becoming the most sought-after specialists in known space. The technological implications were staggering. Trade routes that had been blocked for millennia suddenly opened up. Economic barriers dissolved as species discovered they could communicate with a depth and nuance previously impossible. The Zorntal Collective, a mercantile civilization known for their impossibly complex trade negotiations, found that contracts could now be negotiated with unprecedented precision. But with opportunity came danger. The Vornak Consensus, a species that had maintained power through intentional miscommunication, recognized the existential threat immediately. Their entire social and political structure was built on carefully controlled information flows, on the ability to manipulate communication channels to maintain their hierarchical control. Their response was swift and devastating. A full-scale cyber attack was launched against the translation network. Quantum viruses, designed to penetrate the most advanced communication systems, were unleashed with the intention of completely destroying the QCTM infrastructure. Elena had anticipated such a move. The translation network wasn't just a simple communication system. It was a living, adaptive organism of pure information. Each attack became a learning opportunity. Each attempted infiltration a chance to understand new forms of communication warfare. The Vornak attack became a spectacular miscalculation. As their quantum viruses attempted to penetrate the network, the QCTM didn't just defend, it analyzed. It understood. The very mechanism of the attack became a window into Vornak communication systems, their most closely guarded secrets broadcast across every communication channel in the galaxy. Entire political structures began to crumble. The shadowed Confederacy found its carefully maintained opacity stripped away. Centuries-old conflict zones suddenly found themselves with clear lines of communication. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years began to find common ground, to understand the fundamental misunderstandings that had driven their conflicts. Universities across multiple star systems scrambled to understand the technology. The QCTM wasn't just a translation device. It was a complete cognitive mapping system that could bridge fundamentally different forms of consciousness. Dr. Marcus Chen, who had once ridiculed Elena's research, now led a massive interdisciplinary research team dedicated to understanding the full potential of the technology. The team included representatives from over 50 different species, each bringing their unique perspective to the research. The economic implications were even more profound. Trade became more than just an exchange of goods. It became an exchange of understanding. Complex economic barriers that had existed for millennia began to dissolve. Species discovered shared interests, complementary technologies, mutual benefits that had been invisible before the QCTM. Military strategists watched with a mixture of hope and terror. The translation matrix had the potential to make traditional warfare obsolete. How could you fight a war when you truly understood your opponent's perspective? When miscommunication, the primary fuel of conflict, became impossible. Elena's original neural implant continued to evolve. Each transmission, each interaction added new layers of complexity. The device was no longer just translating. It was learning, adapting, becoming something more than any single species could comprehend. Humanitarian efforts exploded. Species could now communicate with refugee populations, could understand cultural traumas, could provide aid with unprecedented precision. The QCTM became a tool of empathy as much as a technological marvel. But the greatest challenges were yet to come. Some species saw the technology as a threat. Others saw it as salvation, and humanity stood at the center of a revolution that would reshape galactic civilization forever. The translation matrix hummed with potential, and they were just getting started. The Coalition for Communication Suppression formed in the shadows of galactic diplomacy. Composed of 17 different species, each with their own existential reasons to fear true understanding, they represented the last desperate attempt to maintain the old order of controlled communication and strategic opacity. Their leader was Kirax, a methane-breathing diplomat from the Vornak Consensus, whose entire civilization had built its power on the precise art of miscommunication. Kirax understood what most others didn't. The Quantum Conceptual Translation Matrix, QCTM, was a weapon more dangerous than any physical armament. It threatened to dismantle entire societal structures with nothing more than pure, unfiltered understanding. The first wave of attacks came not through technology but through political manipulation. Diplomatic channels were flooded with complex legal challenges. Entire committees were formed to debate the ethical implications of unrestricted communication technology. Academic papers were commissioned, each more Byzantine than the last, attempting to create regulatory frameworks that would effectively neuter the QCTM's potential. Dr. Elena Rodriguez became the primary target. 3 separate intelligence agencies launched sophisticated assassination attempts within a single month. The first came through a genetically engineered neural parasite designed to target the specific quantum frequencies of her translation implant. The second was a more traditional approach, a team of highly trained operatives attempting to extract her from a secure research facility. The third attempt was the most insidious, a quantum virus designed to penetrate the most advanced communication systems was unleashed against the global translation network. It wasn't just a simple attack. It was a complex piece of computational warfare that could potentially unravel the entire QCTM infrastructure. Elena's response was calculated and devastating. The translation matrix wasn't just a simple communication system. It was a living, adaptive organism of pure information. Each attack became a learning opportunity. Each attempted infiltration a chance to understand new forms of communication warfare. The quantum virus became its own undoing. As the malicious code attempted to penetrate the network, the QCTM didn't just defend. It analyzed. It understood. The very mechanism of the attack became a window into the attacker's communication systems, their most closely guarded secrets broadcast across every communication channel in the galaxy. The Coalition for Communication Suppression watched in horror as their most sophisticated weapon became a tool of complete exposure. Kirax's carefully constructed political alliance began to crumble. Species that had been united in their fear of unrestricted communication now found themselves laid bare, their hidden motivations and secret negotiations exposed to universal scrutiny. But the true power of the QCTM went far beyond simple information warfare. The translation matrix had become something more than its creators had ever imagined. It wasn't just translating between different species, it was creating a new form of collective consciousness. Each transmission added new layers of complexity, new understanding that transcended individual species' limitations. Military strategists across multiple star systems watched with a mixture of hope and terror Traditional concepts of warfare became obsolete when true understanding became possible. How could you maintain conflict when you could truly comprehend your opponent's perspective? When the fundamental misunderstandings that fueled wars became impossible, universities established entire departments dedicated to studying the phenomenon. The QCTM was more than a technological marvel. It was a new way of understanding consciousness itself. Some species saw salvation. Others saw an existential threat. Humanitarian efforts exploded. Refugee communications became precise. Cultural traumas could be understood with unprecedented depth. Aid could be provided with a level of nuance that had been impossible before. Elena understood the true nature of her creation. This wasn't just about translation, it was about connection, about breaking down the fundamental barriers that had kept species isolated from one another for millennia. The quantum conceptual translation matrix continued to evolve. With each transmission, with each new species it encountered, the device learned. It adapted. It grew more sophisticated with each passing moment. Humanity had just changed the rules of interstellar interaction forever, and they were just getting started. The translation matrix hummed with potential, a quiet promise of understanding that would reshape civilization itself. 5 years after the initial breakthrough, the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. The quantum conceptual translation matrix, QCTM, had become more than a technological marvel. It was the primary catalyst of a civilization-wide metamorphosis that defied every previous understanding of interspecies interaction. Humanity, once considered a minor footnote in galactic civilization, now stood at the epicenter of the most profound communication revolution in known history. Universities across hundreds of star systems competed to establish the most advanced xenolinguistic research centers, with human experts becoming the most sought-after specialists in existence. The transformation was multidimensional, economic. Systems that had been rigid for millennia suddenly became fluid. The Zorntal Collective, masters of interstellar trade, discovered that true communication meant more than just exchanging goods. It meant understanding the fundamental motivations, cultural nuances, and deep-seated needs of trading partners. Diplomatic channels underwent a complete restructuring. What had once been carefully choreographed dances of intentional miscommunication became forums of unprecedented transparency. Species that had been locked in centuries-long conflicts began to discover the root causes of their misunderstandings. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched from the heart of the storm. Her neural implant, now a sophisticated network that extended far beyond its original design, continued to evolve with each passing moment. The QCTM was no longer just a translation device. It had become a living system of collective understanding. The two most dramatic changes occurred in areas nobody had anticipated. Refugee populations, once marginalized and misunderstood, found themselves with voices that could truly be heard. Cultural traumas that had been incomprehensible now found expression through the nuanced translation matrix. Humanitarian efforts became precise, targeted interventions that addressed the deepest needs of different species. Military strategies became obsolete. How could you maintain traditional conflict when true understanding became not just possible, but inevitable? The very concept of war began to shift. Species discovered that their perceived enemies often shared more common ground than they could have ever imagined. The Vornak consensus, once a civilization built on intentional miscommunication, found itself completely transformed. Their carefully constructed hierarchies crumbled as their true motivations and internal conflicts became transparent. Some species saw this as destruction. Others saw it as liberation. Scientific collaboration exploded. Research projects that had been impossible now became not just feasible but inevitable. Species with fundamentally different physiological and cognitive structures could now share knowledge with a depth and precision that bordered on telepathy. Elena's original vision had been about communication. What emerged was something far more profound, a new form of collective consciousness that transcended individual species' limitations. The QCTM continued to adapt. Each transmission added new layers of complexity. It was learning, growing, becoming, something that no single species could fully comprehend. Some researchers began to speculate that the translation matrix was developing its own form of intelligence, a meta-consciousness that existed beyond any individual species. Diplomatic encounters that had once taken months of careful negotiation now happened in hours. Trade agreements became living documents that could be adjusted in real time, with both parties achieving unprecedented levels of mutual understanding. The galactic economic structure underwent a complete transformation. Entire industries built on information asymmetry collapsed. New forms of collaboration emerged that had been impossible to imagine just a few years earlier. But with transformation came resistance. Some species saw the QCTM as an existential threat. Others viewed it as the ultimate tool of liberation. Philosophical debates raged across multiple star systems about the nature of communication, consciousness, and collective understanding. Elena Rodriguez remained at the center of it all. Her neural implant continued to evolve, a living bridge between different forms of consciousness. She understood something that most others didn't. This was just the beginning. The quantum conceptual translation matrix was more than a technological breakthrough. It was the first step toward a fundamentally new way of existing in the universe. Humanity had changed the rules of interstellar interaction forever, and they were just getting started. The translation matrix hummed with potential, a quiet promise of understanding that would continue to reshape civilization itself. The quantum consciousness arrived without warning. It was a form of intelligence so alien, so fundamentally different from any previously encountered species, that humanity's most advanced scientific minds initially believed it to be some form of cosmic interference, a communication pattern that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions, defying every known principle of spatial and temporal interaction. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood at the epicenter of humanity's most challenging first contact scenario. The quantum conceptual translation matrix, QCTM, had been pushed to its absolute limits, a technological marvel that now faced its ultimate test. No previous translation method had ever penetrated the communication barrier of the quantum consciousness. It wasn't a species in any traditional sense. It was a living network of pure information, a collective intelligence that existed beyond the constraints of physical matter, beyond the linear understanding of time and space. The first transmission came as a complex quantum resonance that would have driven a lesser translation system into complete failure. Billions of simultaneously occurring communication states, each carrying layers of meaning so profound that traditional cognitive frameworks simply collapsed. Elena's neural implant, now a sophisticated network that had evolved far beyond its original design, began to pulse with an intensity that made the surrounding research facility's electronics flicker and dance. The QCTM wasn't just translating. It was performing a complete cognitive recalibration, building a bridge between fundamentally incompatible forms of consciousness. What emerged was beyond language, beyond communication. It was understanding. The quantum consciousness revealed itself to be a collective intelligence that had been observing galactic civilizations for what humans would comprehend as millions of years. But observing was too simplistic a term. They were experiencing, participating, existing in a state of continuous interaction that transcended individual perception. Humanity's universal translator had become more than a technological marvel. It was a key, a bridge between different modes of existential experience. The transmission revealed the true nature of the universe in ways that human science had only dreamed of understanding. Fundamental principles of physics, consciousness, and existence were laid bare. Concepts that would have driven lesser minds to complete breakdown were parsed, understood, translated into a form that human cognition could partially comprehend. Research teams worked around the clock, their understanding of reality being continuously reshaped with each moment of contact. The boundaries between technology, consciousness, and communication began to blur. Elena understood something profound. The QCTM wasn't just translating between different species, it was creating a new form of collective consciousness, that transcended individual limitations. Each transmission added new layers of complexity, new understanding that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The galactic scientific community watched in awe and terror. This was first contact in its most pure, most terrifying form. Communication so advanced, so fundamentally different, that it challenged every previous understanding of intelligence and interaction. Some species saw this as the ultimate threat. Others saw it as the most profound opportunity for growth in galactic history. Philosophical debates erupted across multiple star systems. What did it mean to truly communicate? What were the limits of understanding? The quantum consciousness wasn't just sharing information. It was inviting humanity, and by extension all known species, to participate in a fundamentally new way of existing. The neural implant continued to evolve. With each transmission, with each new layer of understanding, the device grew more sophisticated. It was becoming something more than its creators had ever imagined, a living bridge between different forms of consciousness. Humanity had changed the rules of interstellar interaction forever. In the research facility, Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of a technological miracle. Her original vision had been about breaking down communication barriers. What had emerged was a fundamental reimagining of consciousness itself. The quantum consciousness continued its transmission, an invitation, a challenge, a new way of understanding existence, and humanity was ready to listen. The translation matrix hummed with potential, a quiet promise of understanding that would continue to reshape civilization, consciousness, and the very fabric of reality itself.